Hey everybody, thanks for watching the Pastel Lessons for the Beginners Part 1. Part 2 will be coming shortly. Hi everybody, these are Pastel Lessons for the Beginning by Marianna McDonald. And there's two things we need to really think about to begin with. The type of pastels we're going to use and the type of paper. Now pastels come in two versions. They're all soft pastels. We're not using oil pastels. The harder pastels are the pastel pencils and the new pastels. A medium hardness would be Rembrandt, and there are some of the very soft ones. Now, when I'm working on a project, this is one of the pieces that I'm doing right now. Here's a reference photo. Couple other little color studies that I'm doing from the reference photos. I pull all these pastels out while I'm kind of choose them to begin with, put them on a piece of paper or cloth, and keep them separate from the boxes, mini boxes. So of the hard pastels, I think probably the most important set that you could buy is Prismacolor's New Pastels. The new pastels, they're fairly hard, but they're very versatile, and we'll get into the different ways to use them. I like the set of 96. That's all the colors that they make. This is a couple sets of 96 put together just in a different box. Now here's another set if you have a little extra money. I really like the Sennelier 80 landscape half sticks for plein air. I like the plein air set because I am a landscape artist, and those colors are a little less vibrant than just the assorted set. Now this set that I have, that I actually take out to do plein air, this one is called the Paris collection, and it's probably a combination of the two, the assorted set and the landscape set. Another set of pastels that we're getting into more expensive soft pastels is Terry Ludwig. He makes just gorgeous colors. They're very, very soft and very heavily pigmented. That's a set of 30 warm greens. These are Jack Richardson. Desmond O'Hagan is a nationally known artist, and he chose these particular colors of 40 for one of his demonstration pieces, and that's some of the 40. It's been messed around with a lot. Here's some more hand-rolled Jack Richardsons. These are not very big. Not very big at all, but I like the half sticks because you're going to break them in half anyway, and I'll get to that in a little while. So why not start out with a little less expense in the size that you need. Now these are Blue Earth. They're sold by the Dakota Art Company. And I really like these because they're put up in a pure pigment, and then each layer of pigments is grayed down a little bit more. So this would be your pure pigment from very dark to very light. Here's some Schminkies, also lovely, very soft. Haven't used these much. Look how clean they are. Very soft set. When you're thinking about pastel, people often ask me, do I use a fixative? This is the only fixative that I use now. It's made by Krylon. It's called a fine art fixative. That changes the color of your final piece very little, very, very little. I guess the other thing I should tell you is, these Conte pencils. I like to start out drawing the basic large shapes with these. It's a very hard pastel pencil. The thing that you've got to remember about these is you need to sharpen them with a matte knife. Don't put them in a pencil sharpener because it'll break the lead. I think that's all I need to tell you about pastels. Now, the next little section, I'm going to tell you about all the different kinds of paper. But just remember, if you're just beginning, these are probably the best ones to buy. I think there's a set of like 48 instead of 96 new pastels. Now, the second part of the materials section of beginning pastel is about paper. Paper comes in just plain paper, and then a textured paper and a sanded paper. When I first started working in pastel back in college, we had a paper called velour, which was kind of like a velvet, and it was not a very interesting paper to work with. It wouldn't hold a sharp edge. So let me show you what this is Canson Maitiens, which is French for many colors. Canson, it's just a paper, just a thin piece of paper, and it has a smooth side, which they don't intend you to use because that's where they stick their label. Canson. This is sand color. And then they have the rough side. And the way they make the rough side is by putting dents in it. So with pastel, the paper has to have a texture to it in order for the pastel to stick. The pastel won't stick very well on just a smooth piece of paper. This piece and this piece are both done on the Canson. Now this is on the smooth side, and when you work on the smooth side, you can only put a couple layers of color on top of each other. And this is on the rough side, and again, you could only put a couple layers of color on top of each other before it starts slipping around. Now another paper that I used early on in my years of doing pastel is called La Carte, and it is made by the Sennelier company. This is La Carte. It's a textured, sanded type paper. The texture is created with some kind of a vegetable something or another, and this is what happens when it gets wet. See down here in the corner? So this is one paper you absolutely, La Carte, you would not want to get wet, but it does produce a nice sanded surface that will hold quite a few more layers of color, probably about 5, 6. Another paper, let's see. Well, here, I might as well talk about my favorite paper. This is UArt, sanded paper. It's 400 grit. UArt comes in either cream color or it also comes in black. Now this was cream color to start with. Where's my sanded paper? Here it is. This is what it starts out looking like. So this is UArt 400 grit. Pastel looks better on a colored surface. So with this UArt, it will accept as the underpainting, it will accept watercolor, really, really thin down oil paint, and pastel plus alcohol. When I get around to the demonstration part, I'll show you what that looks like. On this particular paper, I took acrylic paint, very thin acrylic paint, and colored the surface before I got started onto the little piece. Here's another one, and I think I colored this paper. This was start out to be a plein air piece, and I colored the paper a consistent tan color so that when I was out there doing the plein air piece, all I had to take with me was my pastels. I didn't have to take watercolor or anything else. Now, another way that you can work, and I did this early on too in my career with pastel, you can work on a watercolor paper. Watercolor paper has a texture. This is cold press. Hot press is real slick, so this is cold press. And that dark blue is the underpainting that I put down with watercolor. That tan color is the underpainting, that dark tan. And then after it dries, then you put pastel over top of it. It makes a very interesting texture. but it also will only hold a couple layers of color. This one is done with a pastel primer. Now the primer, I'll have to take a picture of it later. The primer comes in a jar, and it is a acrylic textured ground. And you paint it onto a surface. I usually color the surface first, paint the texture on, let it dry, and then when you rub the pastel over top of it, you get a really interesting brush stroke type texture. This is a type of pastel primer that I painted onto Reeves BFK printmaking paper. The reason I like to use that paper is it's very tough and it doesn't warp. This is another paper by Art Spectrum, also sanded, nice and gritty. Let's talk about coloring your paper. These are all the same color of pastel on different surfaces, different color surfaces. So you can see here on the white, the pastel is not nearly as brilliant. Little pieces of the white can show through. Here on the tan, much more brilliant. The different color of the underpainting or the surface of the paper can determine also kind of the look of the colors. For instance, if you had a painting in the fall with a hole, you're going to use a whole lot of orange pastels. Like with this one, you wouldn't want your paper to be real orange because then your orangey color won't show up. In this case, I use that kind of, see that little tan up there at the top? That's the color of the paper. I would say if you're first starting out, you just want to get a little taste of what pastel is like, go ahead and use and buy the Canson. You can buy it at Michael's. But know that when you're using the Canson, you can only use a couple layers of color on top of each other. And it's not sanded. It's that's the textured paper side. Now, if you want to use the textured side, please use a Canson paper that's in the tan color or the gray, because if you use one that's white, the texture, that white texture, will show through and weaken your color. See how that tan texture is showing through on that one? Okay, so that's a pretty good rendition of paper. When I get into the demonstration piece, I'll be showing you how I color the paper, and there's a lot of different ways to color the Canson paper, or not the Canson, the UArt paper, UArt 400. Now the reason I say 400 is UArt comes in different grit levels, just like sandpaper. It's a sanded paper, but it's archival. It's made just for pastel. I like the 400 grit because the 280 grit is really, really rough. I had a hard time getting the pastel just to stick to the surface. And the 800 is very fine. You might want to use it for portraits. Let's see. That one's done on UArt. And so is that one. So there you can see where I colored the paper gray to start with. Gray is a nice neutral. That's UArt paper that I'm just testing colors on. That's a little tiny study with UArt. So these are different plein air pieces. Usually when I do plein air, I usually color the paper first before I go out. The dryness of the air in the winter time makes the paper kind of roll up there at the end. There I colored the paper that kind of blue color, which didn't work very well since it was early spring and everything had kind of a bluish kind of greenish color to it. That one probably would have worked better on a warmer surface. There's a couple of color studies. That's a piece that I did down at Red River Gorge on gray. There's one, the gray paper is a little bit lighter gray. So the next part of the lessons will be a demonstration. This is the golden product of Pastel Primer Gel Medium. It adds a texture to your paper, and it is clear. This one is also a pastel primer. It's made by Art Spectrum, and it comes in color. These are watercolors that you might want to color your UArt paper with. Also, I use acrylic, very thin down acrylic. Also, with rubbing alcohol, you can put rubbing alcohol over top of just basic pastel to create an underpainting. Here are two examples of how I have colored the UArt paper. Don't worry, the demonstration piece for the beginners are not going to be this complicated. But here's the cream-colored UArt paper, and I just rubbed some fairly hard pastels, the new pastels, into the paper with a loose block in of my design. Here's where I took rubbing alcohol and washed that color, liquefied the color into the paper. That way your underpainting is set, won't come back up when you put another layer on top of it. And here are the final layers of the pastel on top of that colored surface, the underpainting. In this case, I used watercolor, and see the dark kind of bluish purple lines there? I did those lines initially with the pastel pencil. Then I colored in the basic shapes with watercolor, keeping to what is very dark. I use a very dark watercolor. What's going to be kind of an orange sunshiny area. With the underpainting, you just want to keep it loose. You don't want to get real detailed. And then here is the secondary section, starting to add the pastel over the underpainting. And then here is what the final, with quite a few layers of pastel on top of the underpainting. Hey, thanks for watching Pastel Lessons for the Beginners, Part 1. This is the technical part about the actual pastels, the kinds I like to use, and the different types of paper, ranging from just basic paper to all the different versions of sanded paper. Now this is the end of Part 1, and Part 2 will be a demonstration.